Delphine, you thought you could hide your lies forever? Everyone here deserves to know the truth. Your empire is built on deception. For everyone's comfort, but only Kafir. It would be best if Delphine left.
"40 years of my life, and he moved her into my seat before the champagne even went flat. Delphine, don't make a scene. Not tonight. I'm not the one making a scene, Taejin. You are. You just don't recognize it because you're the one holding the microphone. This is a celebration. 40 years. The board is here. Investors are here. Jihye has been a tremendous asset to this family this past year, and I think it's time everyone understood her place in it. Her place. Effective tonight, Jihye will be moving into the East Wing. And Delphine, I think for everyone's comfort, for the staff, for the optics with the Osaka partners flying in next week, it would be best if you took the guest house. Or found somewhere else entirely. You've given this family 40 good years. Let this be a graceful exit. 200 people in that ballroom, and not one of them looked away. That was the part he miscalculated. He thought I'd flinch in front of an audience. He built his whole life on the assumption that after 4 decades of being quiet, I had forgotten how to be anything else. I want you to understand the room, because the room is part of the story. This was not some small family dinner where a scene could be quietly smoothed over by the time dessert arrived. This was the Regency Ballroom at the Fairview Grand, 40 round tables of 10. The entire senior leadership of Halcyon Pacific Trading seated alongside the visiting delegation from our Osaka shipping partners, 3 members of the city council who owed their last 2 campaigns to Taejin's contributions, and a string quartet that had been playing since 7 o'clock and did not stop, even as the temperature of the room changed entirely. Jihye Kwon was seated at the head table. My seat. The one I had occupied at every company function for 4 decades. The one with my name still printed on the place card, because whoever had reseated the head table that afternoon had apparently not been told to remove it. She was wearing a wine-coloured dress and an expression that kept flickering every few seconds between triumph and something that looked almost like fear, as though some part of her understood, even in that moment of apparent victory, that she had not actually won anything yet. Taejin, I want to be very clear about what I heard you just say, in front of this entire room, so there's no confusion later about what happened here tonight. You are asking your wife of 40 years to vacate her own home so your mistress can move into it. Delphine, that's not. I'm asking you to consider the family's image. The optics with our partners. The optics with our partners. 40 years, Taejin. I raised our son in that house. I hosted every single one of these partners in that house at one point or another over 4 decades. And tonight, in front of them, you're telling me the optics require that I be the one who disappears. I have never once been the quiet one. I only ever let him believe that, because being underestimated was the only piece of leverage a woman my age gets handed for free, and I was not about to spend it before it mattered. I am 63 years old. I built this family's fortune before Taejin ever put his name on a single deed, and tonight, in front of his board, his mistress, and 200 witnesses, my husband of 40 years just tried to throw me out of an empire he does not know I own. If you have ever stood in a room where someone tried to make your quiet look like weakness, drop your city below. I want to see how many of us there are. Let me tell you how we got here. 40 years ago I was 23, working the books for a small import company on the Seattle waterfront, the kind of place that moved textiles and machine parts and pretended not to notice when a shipment ran a little heavier than the manifest said. My father had built that company from a single warehouse and a line of credit nobody thought he'd pay back, and by the time I was old enough to understand what he actually did for a living, I already understood the numbers better than any of the men he trusted to run them. Taejin came into my father's office when he was 26, sent by his own father's organization out of Busan to negotiate a shipping partnership that would let both families move product through the Pacific corridor without stepping on each other's territory. He was sharp and controlled and terrifyingly calm in a room full of men twice his age, and he looked at me exactly once during that first meeting, which was once more than any of the other men in that room bothered to. He came back a week later, alone, and asked my father if he could take me to dinner. My father laughed in his face and told him I wasn't part of the negotiation. Taejin said he understood, and then he asked me himself, in the hallway, on his way out. I said yes, because he was the first man who had ever asked instead of assumed. Those first years were not what people imagine when they picture a marriage built on the back of an alliance between two shipping families. Taejin was genuinely brilliant in those days, not yet hardened into the man who would later stand in front of 200 people and tell his wife to vacate her own home, but a young man who worked 18-hour days trying to prove to his own father, half a world away in Busan, that sending him to Seattle had not been a demotion in disguise. I used to bring him dinner in the warehouse office at midnight because he'd forget to eat, and he used to read every shipping manifest twice before signing it, because his father had taught him that carelessness in that business got people killed. I loved him for that carefulness before I understood it would eventually curdle into something colder. In those years, he asked my opinion on things. He asked what I thought about a new distributor, whether a particular partner felt trustworthy, whether the numbers on a deal actually made sense the way the other side was presenting them. I was better with numbers than he was. And for the first decade of our marriage, he knew it and used it, and never once made me feel small for it. My father watched all of this with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has correctly assessed another man's character. He liked Taejin. He trusted him enough to bring him deeper into the business than most sons-in-law in that world ever get brought. But my father was also a man who had spent 30 years watching partnerships between families dissolve into resentment the moment one side felt the other had gotten the better half of the arrangement. And so when it came time to formalize Halcyon Pacific as a holding structure, he did something he never explained to anyone, including Taejin, including for the first several years even me. He split the founding shares between himself and me alone. Not a joint structure between the two families. Not a 50-50 split between himself and his new son-in-law. A private holding company with founding equity held entirely inside our own bloodline, with Taejin brought in as chief executive and given full operational authority, full public credit, full command of the empire that would eventually be built on top of that foundation, but never given the deed to the foundation itself. When my father finally told me what he'd done, I was 26 years old and newly pregnant with Malcolm, and I remember asking him why. Because your husband is a good man today, Delphine. But good men change when enough time and enough success convince them they built everything themselves. I am not protecting you from Taejin as he is. I am protecting you from the man success might eventually turn him into. I did not fully understand what he meant for another 30 years. I understand it completely now. We married 11 months later. My father structured it the way men in that world structure everything as an alliance. 2 shipping networks folding into one holding company, a joint venture called Halcyon Pacific Trading that existed on paper as a legitimate freight and logistics firm and existed everywhere else as the skeleton that both families' real business hung on. Here is the part Taejin never fully understood, because he was too busy building his reputation to read the paperwork his own father-in-law drew up. My father did not fold his company into the marriage. He folded it into me. Halcyon Pacific Trading was structured as a private holding company with founding shares split between my father and myself, not between my father and Taejin's family. When my father passed 9 years into the marriage, his shares transferred to me under the company's own founding bylaws, the ones written before Taejin An ever set foot in that office. Taejin ran the operations. Taejin built the empire on top of the frame. Taejin's name went on every building, every contract, every headline. But the frame itself, the founding shares, the controlling interest in the holding company that legally owned the parent structure beneath every subsidiary he ever built that stayed in my name, quietly, for 40 years, because nobody ever thought to ask the wife of the boss whether she still held paper on the company her own father built. I let them believe I didn't. I signed exactly the documents I was told to sign, and kept every original copy of everything else in a safety deposit box under my maiden name in a bank Taejin has never once set foot in. For 40 years, I ran the house, hosted the dinners, raised our son, and smiled at every board meeting I was allowed to sit in on as Mrs. An, while my husband built an empire on a foundation he never once checked the deed to. I did not do this because I distrusted him on the day we married. I did this because my father raised me to understand one rule above every other rule in that world. Never let the only proof of what's yours live in someone else's hands. 40 years later, that rule is the only reason I am still standing in this house tonight, instead of packing a bag. The affair had been going on for 11 months before tonight. I knew almost from the beginning. Ji-hye Kwon started as a junior liaison in the Seoul office, 29 years old, sharp, ambitious. Exactly the kind of woman Tae-jin has always had a weakness for someone young enough to make him feel like the 26-year-old who walked into my father's office instead of the 66-year-old he actually is. I found out the way wives like me always find out. Not from a confrontation, not from a confession, but from a driver who mentioned an unfamiliar address twice in 1 week, and then a credit card statement that had a jewelry purchase on it I never received, and then simply from watching my husband in a room and understanding, the way you understand weather changing, that something in him had shifted its attention somewhere else. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this story is supposed to go in every version anyone else would tell it. The wife finds out. The wife weeps into a pillow. The wife loses 10 pounds and stops sleeping and has to be talked off a ledge by her sister. That is not what happened, because I am not built that way and never have been. What I did instead was sit with it for 3 days, the way my father taught me to sit with any piece of information before deciding what to do with it. I watched Tae-jin more closely than I had in years. I noticed the new cologne. I noticed he had started taking calls in the garden instead of his study, where the walls were thinner and less private. I noticed that he had stopped asking my opinion on anything at all, not out of anger, but because he had simply stopped thinking of me as someone whose opinion mattered to the decisions he was making. I also had a longer conversation with Desmond Achebe, who has driven this family for 22 years and who has never once, in that entire time, given me a reason to doubt his discretion. Desmond did not volunteer information. I had to ask him directly, sitting in the back of the car on a Tuesday evening, whether there had been a change in Mr. Arn's schedule over the past few months. Mrs. Arn, I only drive where I'm told to drive. I understand that, Desmond. I'm not asking you to betray anything. I'm asking whether the schedule itself has changed, because I've noticed the car coming back later on Thursdays. There's a residence in the Highlands district. Mr. Arn has had me take him there most Thursday evenings for the last several months. I don't know what happens inside. I only know where I've been asked to wait. That was enough. I did not need Desmond to describe a scene he had never witnessed. I needed only to know that there was a place and a pattern, and that my husband had built both without once mentioning either to me. What I did instead was call my son. Malcolm Arn is 38 years old, and for the last 12 years he has run the finance and compliance division of Halcyon Pacific under his father's direct supervision, which means he has spent 12 years learning exactly how the money in this family actually moves. What his father does not know, what nobody in that boardroom knows, is that Malcolm has known who actually holds the founding shares of this company since he was 26 years old, because I told him myself. The year he graduated with his MBA, sitting across from him at this same kitchen table. I told him because I needed one person inside that company who understood the truth of what our family was actually built on, in case the day ever came when I needed it. I did not tell him to use against his father. I told him because a woman who holds real leverage and shares it with no one dies with that leverage unused, and I was not interested in dying with anything unused. When I called Malcolm 11 months ago and told him what I suspected about Ji-hye, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I will remember for the rest of my life. Mum, if this is happening the way I think it's happening, you're not the one who needs to prepare for a fight. He is. I'm not looking for a fight, Malcolm. I'm looking for the truth. Then let me get it for you. Give me time. I gave him 11 months. In that time, Malcolm quietly built a complete financial and communications trail documenting Ji-hye Kwon's rise through the company, cross-referenced against every irregular transfer, every unusual bonus structure, every meeting she was invited into that she had no operational reason to attend. He did this the way I taught him to do everything that matters in this family, slowly, silently, with paper trails that would hold up under any light anyone eventually chose to shine on them. Malcolm worked the way I raised him to work, which is to say quietly, patiently, and without ever tipping his hand before he had a complete picture. He requested access to the Macau subsidiary's transaction history under the pretense of a routine annual compliance review, which was true often enough in the past that nobody questioned it this time either. He spent 4 months cross-referencing wire transfers against the company's actual staffing and vendor records, looking for the particular kind of gap that shows up when money moves somewhere, no real work exists to justify it. He found Jihei's name attached to a consulting entity called Brightline Advisory Partners, registered 8 months after she joined the Seoul office, with a business address that turned out to be a serviced office suite rented by the week. Brightline had received 11 separate payments from the Macau subsidiary over 4 fiscal quarters, each one authorized by Taejin's direct signature, each one categorized internally as Overflow Consulting Seoul Expansion Initiative. Malcolm cross-checked every invoice against the actual Seoul expansion team's documented deliverables and found no overlap at all. Whatever Brightline Advisory Partners was supposedly doing, none of it appeared anywhere in the actual work product of the division it was supposedly supporting. He also found something else, something he did not tell me about until several weeks after he'd found it, because he wanted to be certain before he brought it to me. Jihei had begun attending strategy sessions for the company's planned expansion into the Jakarta shipping corridor sessions well above her actual pay grade and operational scope, and in 3 separate instances, meeting minutes showed her raising specific questions about subsidiary ownership structures and board voting thresholds that had nothing to do with her stated role in liaison work. Mum, I don't think this is just an affair anymore. I think she's trying to understand how the ownership of this company actually works, from the inside, before anyone else figures out that she's asking. Do you think your father knows that's what she's doing? Honestly? No. I think Dad believes she's interested in the business because she's interested in him. I don't think it's occurred to him that those aren't the same thing. What Malcolm found went well beyond an affair. Jihei Kwon was not simply sleeping with the head of the company. She was systematically positioning herself inside its financial infrastructure, and Taejin, blinded, flattered, 66 years old and desperate to feel 26 again, was helping her do it. The night of our 40th anniversary gala, I stood in that ballroom in a navy dress I had chosen specifically because it was the same color I wore the night my father introduced me to the shipping contract that would become my whole life, and I watched my husband stand in front of 200 people and tell me to leave my own house. He thought I would fold. He thought 40 years of being underestimated had made me soft enough to disappear quietly into a guest house rather than embarrass the family in front of the Osaka partners. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I set my champagne glass down on the nearest table, and I looked at my husband, and I said the only thing that needed saying. Taejin, before you finish reassigning my house, there's something you and the board should probably know first. Delphine, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time. You've made it the time. You stood in front of 200 people and told your wife of 40 years to vacate her own home for the woman you've been sleeping with for the better part of a year. So let's not pretend there's a version of tonight where I quietly leave through the kitchen. The room went the particular kind of silent that only happens when everyone in it understands, at the same moment, that something is about to become permanently different. Jihei, since you're being introduced tonight as the future of this family, maybe you'd like to explain to the board what your actual role has been in the transfers out of the Macau logistics account over the last 4 quarters. Jihei's face did the thing faces do when a person realizes the floor they've been standing on was never as solid as they thought. Taejin's face did something else entirely, the particular stillness of a man running through every possible way this could be a bluff and finding none of them convincing. Delphine, I don't know what you think you know, but this is not the venue. You're right, it isn't. So let's move to a venue that is. I gestured, and Malcolm stepped forward from where he had been standing near the bar all evening, a leather folder under his arm, the same folder I had carried through this house for 40 years without anyone ever asking what was inside it. Dad, I think we should talk. Now. Not in front of the investors. Malcolm, whatever your mother has told you, she hasn't told me anything I haven't already verified myself. I run compliance for this company. I've run it for 12 years, and what I found isn't a rumor. It's a paper trail. For the first time all night, Taejin Ahn looked like a man who understood he had walked into the wrong room. We did not finish that conversation in the ballroom. Taejin had enough presence of mind left to move the 4 of us himself, myself, Malcolm, and a visibly unravelling Jihei into the private study off the east hallway, the same study where he had signed his very first shipping contract with my father 41 years earlier. All right, let's hear it. What exactly is it you think you found, Malcolm? Over the last 4 quarters, roughly $2.2 million has moved out of the Macau Logistics subsidiary through a series of consulting invoices tied to a shell entity registered in Jihei's name. The invoices don't correspond to any actual consulting work performed. I have the wire records, the entity registration, and internal emails authorizing the transfers. Authorized by whom? By you, Dad. Every single one. The silence that followed had weight to it. The specific weight of a man realizing his own signature has become evidence against him. Jihei, is this true? Taejin, I can explain, I asked if it's true. The entity was set up to handle overflow consulting for the Seoul expansion. You approved every transfer yourself. I didn't take anything you didn't already sign off on. That's not what I asked you. Watching my husband's face in that moment, I understood something I had not fully understood before that night. Taejin had not simply been unfaithful. He had been so consumed with proving to himself that he was still the man who could command a room at 26 that he had signed away $2.2 million of company money without reading what he was signing, because a 29-year-old woman told him it was fine, and he wanted, badly, to believe her. Malcolm, I want to see every one of those documents. You'll see them tomorrow, in front of the full board, exactly the way Mum's arranging it. Taejin turned to me slowly, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something in his face that wasn't command or certainty. It was the beginning of fear. Delphine, what did you do? Comment Yuan Seiken if you know exactly what it feels like to watch someone realize, 1 full second too late, that they never actually knew who they were standing next to. I didn't do anything, Taejin. I simply stopped standing quietly in the corner of a company I have owned the controlling interest of since before our son was born. That's not possible. I built this company. You built the business on top of it. You never once owned the frame underneath it. My father structured Halcyon Pacific's founding shares between himself and me, not between himself and you. When he passed, his shares came to me under the original bylaws. Every subsidiary you have built for the last 30 years, the shipping arm, the logistics arm, the real estate holdings, all of it sits legally underneath a parent holding company where I have held the controlling interest since I was 32 years old. That's no. My legal team would have flagged that decades ago. Your legal team never asked to see the original 1986 founding documents because nobody in this family has ever once questioned whether the quiet wife might be the one actually holding the paper. I want to tell you something about the exact expression on my husband's face in that moment because I have thought about it every day since. It was not anger. It was recognition, the specific, sick recognition of a man realizing that the one person in his life he had spent 40 years assuming was fully accounted for had, in fact, never been anything close to accounted for at all. The board meeting the next morning did not go the way Taejin spent the night preparing for. I know this because Malcolm told me he barely slept, running scenario after scenario with the family's legal counsel, trying to find some framing where the $2.2 million in misappropriated funds could be explained as an operational oversight rather than what it actually was. He never got the chance to present any framing at all because I arrived 20 minutes before the meeting with a stack of documents of my own. The board of Halcyon Pacific Trading is 11 people. 4 of them are legacy appointees from my father's original partnership era. Men now in their 70s and 80s who have sat quietly through decades of Taejin's expansion without much comment because the numbers were good and nobody asks hard questions when the numbers are good. 3 of them are Taejin's own appointees, men loyal to him personally. The remaining 4 are institutional representatives from the pension funds and family offices that hold minority stakes across various subsidiaries. I had spent the 11 months Malcolm spent building his financial trail doing something of my own quietly meeting. One at a time, over lunch, over tea, over nothing more suspicious than an old friend catching up, with each of the 4 legacy board members my father had originally seated. I reminded them, gently, of the history none of them had thought about in years. I reminded them whose name was actually on the founding documents. I did not ask them for loyalty. I simply asked them to look at the paperwork themselves, quietly, before making up their minds about anything. By the morning of that board meeting, all 4 of them already knew exactly what Malcolm was about to present. Mr. Ahn, before we begin the standard quarterly review, The board has received documentation regarding unauthorized transfers totaling $2.2 million out of the Macau subsidiary, tied to invoices for consulting work that appears not to have been performed. We've also received documentation regarding the original 1986 founding share structure of this holding company, which the board's legal counsel has independently verified overnight. This is, I'd like the opportunity to address both matters directly. You'll have that opportunity. But I think it's important the full board understands, before you speak, that the controlling interest in this holding company has never legally rested with you, Mr. Ahn. It has rested since 1995 with your wife. I watched Taijin's 3 loyal appointees exchange the specific look of men, realizing their own votes had just become far less relevant than they assumed walking into that room. Mrs. Ahn, given the board's findings regarding both the Macau transfers and the underlying ownership structure, we'd like to understand your position before we proceed to any vote. My position is simple. I have no interest in destroying a company my father spent his life building, or that my husband spent 40 years expanding. I have every interest in ensuring it is run by someone whose judgment the board and I can actually trust going forward. I'd ask the board to vote on removing Taijin Ahn from his position as chief executive, effective immediately, pending a full independent audit of the Macau transfers. I would ask that Malcolm Ahn be appointed interim chief executive, given his 12 years overseeing this company's compliance function and his complete familiarity with its operations. Delphine, 40 years. You would do this to me in front of the board after 40 years? You did this to yourself in front of 200 people last night, Taijin. I'm simply the one who's choosing not to pretend it didn't happen. Before the vote, one of the 4 legacy board members, a man named Harold Bianchi, 78 years old, who had sat on this board since before Malcolm was born, asked to speak. I've known this family a long time. I sat across the table from Delphine's father the year he structured this holding company, and I want the record to reflect that nothing being presented today is a surprise dressed up as one. What's a surprise is that it took 40 years for anyone to test what was actually written down. I'd like to say, for whatever it's worth, that I think this board should have paid closer attention decades ago, instead of assuming the founder's daughter was simply along for the ride. Taijin's 3 loyal appointees pushed back, as I expected them to. One of them, a younger executive named Julian Cross, who owed his entire career to Taijin's patronage, tried a different angle entirely. With respect, Mrs. Ahn has no operational experience running a company of this size. Removing Mr. Ahn in favor of a compliance officer, however capable, during an active audit, creates enormous instability with our banking partners and our Osaka investors specifically. I'd ask the board to consider a suspension rather than a removal, pending the audit's conclusion. Mr. Cross, I appreciate the concern for stability. I'd ask you to consider what's actually more destabilizing to our banking partners, a temporary leadership transition to a 12-year compliance veteran, or the continued presence, at the helm of this company, of the executive whose signature authorized every single one of the transfers currently under independent audit. The room was quiet after that. Cross did not have a response, because there wasn't one that didn't sound like exactly what it was. I'd also like the board to understand something else, since we're being thorough today. This is not a hostile action against a company I have any interest in seeing fail. I have held the controlling interest in this holding company since I was 32 years old, and in 31 years, I have never once used that position to interfere with how Taijin ran the operational side of this business, because the operational side of this business was genuinely his to run, and he ran it well for most of those years. What changed is not my position. What changed is his judgment and a board's obligation. When a chief executive's judgment becomes a liability to the company's own funds, is not a close call. The vote took under 4 minutes. 8 in favor of removal, 3 opposed. Taijin Ahn walked out of that boardroom, no longer the chief executive of the company that bore his name on every building it owned, and I walked out, still holding exactly what I had walked in, holding the controlling interest in a company he had spent 4 decades building on a foundation that was never his to stand on alone. Taejin did not say another word before he left the boardroom. I watched him walk past 40 years of framed photographs lining the executive hallway groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, handshake photos with 3 generations of partners across the Pacific corridor, and I watched 2 junior staff members near the elevator bank straighten instinctively as he passed, out of decades of habit, before catching themselves and remembering, in real time, that the instinct no longer matched the reality. That particular kind of silence, the sound of an entire building recalibrating who its power actually belongs to, is not something I will forget. Ji-hae Kwon did not survive the fallout either, though her ending arrived by a different road than his. The independent audit Malcolm commissioned confirmed everything the initial documentation suggested the shell entity: the falsified consulting invoices, the systematic siphoning of company funds structured to look, on paper, like legitimate overflow contracting. She was never formally an employee of Halcyon Pacific, which meant there was no clean legal channel to pursue criminal charges through the company itself. And I want to be honest that I never pushed for that outcome regardless. What I pushed for was simpler and, in the world I grew up in, considerably more permanent. The audit findings were shared, quietly and thoroughly, with every partner firm across the Pacific corridor that Ji-hae had used her position to build relationships with over the preceding 18 months. Every introduction she had leveraged, every deal she had positioned herself inside of, every reputation she had spent a year constructing inside an industry built entirely on trust and discretion, all of it collapsed within a single fiscal quarter, once the partners who mattered understood exactly what she had actually been doing behind the consulting invoices. Ji-hae Kwon did not go to prison. She went somewhere, in that world, considerably worse for a woman who had built her entire strategy on being seen as valuable. She became untouchable in an industry that runs entirely on relationships, in a city where everyone who matters eventually hears the same 3 or 4 names when they ask who to trust and who to avoid. I heard, through channels I still maintain out of old habit more than active interest, that she left the country within 6 months. I have not heard her name mentioned in any context since, which in that world is its own kind of verdict. There was one detail Malcolm brought me toward the end of the audit that I think about more than any other part of this entire ordeal. Among Brightline Advisory's internal files the audit team was able to access once the company severed the consulting agreement, there was a single-page document, undated, laying out a proposed restructuring of the Halcyon Pacific board following what it referred to only as a transition in family leadership. The document did not name Ji-hae as its author, but it was saved on a device registered to her, and it outlined, in careful bullet points, a scenario in which Taejin's eventual retirement or incapacitation would create an opening for someone close to him, someone with intimate knowledge of the company's operations but no formal equity stake to be positioned as a stabilizing interim voice on the board. She was not simply having an affair with my husband. She had spent the better part of a year quietly building a case for her own relevance inside a company she had no legal claim to whatsoever, banking entirely on the assumption that the actual ownership structure beneath Taejin was exactly what he believed it to be: nothing. No foundation, nothing underneath him but his own name. She miscalculated in exactly the same way he did, which I suppose is its own kind of poetic symmetry. 2 people convinced that the visible structure of power was the entire structure of power, both of them building elaborate plans on top of a foundation neither one had bothered to actually inspect. I am told she attempted, briefly, to find footing in Singapore before word of the Macau findings caught up with her there as well. The industry we operate in is small, in exactly the way that matters everyone who moves real money, eventually asks the same handful of people, the same handful of questions before they extend trust. And once the answer to what happened with the Ahn family became common knowledge across 3 cities, there was simply nowhere left for her to rebuild the particular kind of credibility her entire strategy had depended on. Taejin tried, in the weeks that followed his removal, to reach me directly several times. He came to the house, my house, the one I had structurally always owned regardless of whose name sat on the utility bills twice, and both times I let him in, because 40 years earns a person one conversation even when it does not earn them forgiveness. Delphine, I need you to understand something. What happened with Ji-hae, it wasn't about you. It was about feeling like I still mattered to someone the way I used to matter when I was young enough to believe I'd never lose it. Taejin, I understand exactly what it was about. That's precisely the problem. I understand it, and I still don't accept it as a reason to humiliate me in front of 200 people and hand a stranger the keys to a house I raised our son in. I made a mistake, a terrible one. But you took the entire company from me. My name is on every building. Your name is on the buildings because you built what sits on top of the foundation. I never once tried to take the foundation from you while you respected what was actually holding the structure up. The moment you decided I was disposable enough to remove from my own home, you removed any reason I had to keep protecting the version of this arrangement where you got to believe you built it alone. So that's it. 40 years, and this is how it ends. 40 years is exactly why it doesn't have to end in ruin, Taijin. You still hold a significant equity stake in this company. You still have your reputation in every market outside the Pacific corridor Jihei burned through. What you don't have anymore is control, and control was never fully yours to begin with. I'd suggest you spend whatever years you have left learning to build something honestly, the way you did the first time, before you ever needed to feel 26 again. The news of his removal moved through the Pacific corridor, the way news like that always moves in that world, not through headlines, because a company like ours has spent decades making sure our business rarely appears in any headline at all, but through the private channels that actually matter. Within a week, every family we had ever done business with, every partner firm in Seoul and Osaka and Vancouver, understood two things clearly. The first was that Taijin An had lost control of the company that bore his name over a mistress and 2.2 million misappropriated dollars. The second, and the one that actually mattered in that world, was that the woman who removed him had been sitting on the controlling interest the entire time, for 40 years, without a single person catching on. I received calls that week I had not expected. Women I had known for decades, wives of other men in this business who had spent those same decades being introduced at the same galas as Mrs. So-and-so and so, called to ask, carefully, delicately, whether it was true. I told each of them the same thing. It was true, and it had always been true, and the only thing that had changed was that I finally had a reason worth using it for. One of those women, a friend named Winifred Achike, whose husband ran a logistics operation out of Vancouver, said something to me on the phone that I have not stopped thinking about since. Delphine, do you understand what you just did? You didn't just take his company. You just told every quiet wife in this entire industry that the paperwork might already belong to her too, and she should go check. I had not thought of it in quite those terms until she said it, but she was right. Within a year, I heard through the same private channels that at least 3 other women in our circle had quietly requested to review their own family's founding documents for the first time in decades. I do not know what any of them found. I only know that the conversation itself had never happened before in any of our lives until it happened in mine, in front of 200 witnesses at my own 40th anniversary gala. He did not come back a third time. He did come back once more, 4 months later, though not to the house. Malcolm ran into him at an industry dinner in Vancouver that neither of them had expected the other to attend. And Taijin, according to Malcolm, looked like a man who had aged considerably more than 4 months in 4 months. He had taken a position as a strategic advisor for a smaller logistics firm out of Portland, the kind of role men in his position accept when they need somewhere to put their reputation while it heals, if it ever fully does. He asked Malcolm, quietly, near the end of the evening, how I was doing. He asked if you were happy, Mum. I told him you'd taken up painting again, the way you used to before I was born. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded and went back to his table. I have taken up painting again. I did not tell Malcolm to mention that specifically, but I was glad he did, because it was true, and because there was something fitting about my husband of 40 years learning, second-hand, through our son, that the version of me he spent 4 decades believing was fully accounted for had quietly kept an entire life of her own, the whole-time hobbies he never asked about, friendships he never noticed, a mind he never once thought to fully consult, running alongside the marriage the way the true foundation of Halcyon Pacific had been running underneath his empire the whole time, invisible only because he had never once thought to look. Malcolm has run Halcyon Pacific for 8 months now, and the company is, by every measure, the board tracks, healthier than it has been in a decade. He inherited his father's discipline and my patience, which turns out to be a considerably more sustainable combination than either quality alone. I sat in on his first full board meeting as chief executive, not because he needed my supervision, but because he asked me to, and because 40 years of sitting quietly in the corner of rooms like that, one had earned me the right to sit in them for a very different reason now. He opened that meeting by doing something his father never once did in 30 years of leadership. He asked the 4 legacy board members, directly, whether there was anything else in this company's founding history the board should be made aware of before moving forward any other quiet arrangement, any other piece of paper nobody had thought to ask about in decades. Harold Bianchi laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard out of that man in years. Mr. Arn, I believe your mother has just spent 40 years teaching this entire boardroom the value of that exact question. I'd say you learned it well. Malcolm restructured the Macau subsidiary within his first quarter, closing the loophole that had allowed Jihei's shell entity to move money in the first place, and instituted a review process requiring 2 independent signatures on any transfer above a set threshold, regardless of who requested it. When I asked him why he'd set the threshold as low as he did, he said something that told me everything about the kind of executive he was going to become. Because I watched what happens when one person's judgment is the only safeguard standing between this company and someone who knows exactly how to exploit it. I'd rather have a system that doesn't need anyone in this family to be perfect. He calls me every Sunday, the way he has since he was a boy, and every few weeks he asks me some version of the same question. Mum, why did you wait 40 years to use what you had? Because leverage you use, the moment you have it, is leverage that's already spent by the time you actually need it, Malcolm. I didn't wait because I was afraid. I waited because the day I needed it, I wanted it to still be worth something. I am 63 years old, and I have spent 40 of those years being introduced at galas as Mrs. Arn, the quiet one, the wife who picked the fabric swatches and signed whatever was placed in front of her. I let an entire industry believe that for 4 decades, because the day a man decides you are disposable enough to remove from your own home in front of 200 witnesses, is the day you find out exactly how much all that quiet was actually worth. It was worth everything he built. Every foundation eventually gets tested by the things standing on top of it. Mine held for 40 years because I built it to last longer than anyone standing on it. His collapsed in a single ballroom because he never once checked what he was standing on at all. I still live in that house. I chose to keep it, not because I need the space, but because I earned every square foot of it 40 years before he ever thought to ask me to leave. Sometimes, on Sunday afternoons, Malcolm brings his own daughter over. My granddaughter, 7 years old, and already sharper with numbers than either of her parents like to admit out loud. She likes to sit at the kitchen table where I once sat across from my own father, learning what it meant to hold something quietly. And she asks me questions about the paintings on the walls, the ones I started again after 40 years of setting the habit aside for a marriage that eventually stopped asking what else I might have been. I tell her the truth, the same way my father told me the truth. In pieces, at the ages when pieces make sense. I tell her that the quiet ones in a room are not always the smallest ones in it. I tell her that a woman does not need to raise her voice to be the loudest person standing there, if she has spent enough years making sure the ground underneath everyone else's confidence actually belongs to her. I do not know if she will remember any of this by the time she is old enough for it to matter. But I know I will have told her, the way my father told me, and the way I told Malcolm, so that whatever she eventually builds, or marries into, or is handed by people who assume she'll simply be grateful for whatever she's given, she will at least know to ask the one question none of us are ever taught to ask early enough. Whose name is actually on the foundation?